Emily Williams. I'm the Director of Community and University Relations at the Institute. And this morning, I'm just going to give a couple housekeeping rules for the bagel breakfast today. And then I'm going to turn it over to Regina to introduce our speaker. So first of all, we're recording so that this can be played back for folks that couldn't come, just so you know. And then Chandra's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then she's going to open up for discussion. So if you could let her speak, and then save your questions for when she's finished, and then we'll begin the conversation. So Regina, I'm going to turn it over to you to do the intro.
Sounds good. We're so excited to have Chandra with us today. She is a senior attorney and leader of the Southern Environmental Law Center's Environmental Justice Initiatives. She is a two-time UNC graduate, receiving her undergraduate and her law degree from Carolina. And Chandra is also a member of the Institute for the Environment's Board of Visitors. At our last meeting, following a presentation by myself and Kathleen, we talked about our DEI work and the group that we have, the committee that we have. And Chandra expressed an interest during the meeting and after the meeting about getting involved in our efforts. So I thought, after speaking with Emily about reactivating the bagel breakfast, that this would be a great first step. And so we're excited to hear from Chandra and hear about her work in environmental justice. Chandra.
Thank you, Regina, and thank you, Emily. It's nice to see everybody this morning, and know, if I can't see you, to know that you are here, because I see your names at least. So I'll share my screen. So I am on participant mode, so if someone can enable my screen sharing, then I'll share my screen. All right.
We're working on it.
I think y'all done it.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. SELC has been doing environmental justice work. So Southern Environmental Law Center, that's where I practice. We've been doing environmental justice work for quite some time, but have chosen to be very intentional about it and started our environmental justice initiative just this year. So I am leading the initiative. I work in the Chapel Hill office of SELC. So my work before leading the EJ initiative really focused on water quality in particular. And ever since I started here in 2006, I've been very intentional about making sure that we were delivering our work, delivering, our services to communities of color in the Southeast. I'm licensed in the state of North Carolina, so particularly in the state of North Carolina. So most of that work is with communities and nonprofits who have contaminated sites in their community, who are trying to prevent water pollution. These images are of me and some of our partners in the state of North Carolina. Both of these are leaders who have been working on contaminated site issues. In the upper left corner, there's myself and the mayor of the town of Navassa. He's been working with regard to a Superfund site cleanup for quite some time. And then in the next slide, there's myself and the leader of Concerned Citizens of West Baden community. There's also a aluminum smelting site in their community, and he's been leading the advocacy on getting that addressed. Both of these communities, because it's an environmental justice issue, the town of Navassa is predominantly African-American, and the community of West Baden, where the aluminum smelter is also a African-American neighborhood in the town. A little bit of background on SELC. So we have 9 offices. We are in 6 southeastern states: North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, as well as Virginia, and we have an office in Washington, D.C. So we have another, in order to get up to 9 offices, there are 2 offices in North Carolina, Chapel Hill and Asheville. There are also 2 offices in Virginia, Richmond and Charlottesville. So over 80 attorneys and over 200 active cases. And our work basically is in, we work with agencies. We encourage them to do what we know they're tasked to do in terms of making sure that our regulations are compliant with federal statutes. We work in the legislatures in all of our states, as well as in Congress, to try to get good laws passed and to prevent laws that would be harmful to public health and the environment. And then the tool that we use at the end of the day, when all of the other efforts to protect human health and the environment have not yielded the results that we and our clients are looking for, then we file litigation. So our program areas include clean water, clean air, coast and wetlands, land and community. We have a new wildlife program as well as a forestry program. And then we have several initiatives, including the Environmental Justice Initiative. So I think it's helpful to ground a discussion on environmental justice with talking really about, like, well, what is environmental injustice? What are the causes, and how can we work to address environmental injustice? So the fact is, poor communities and communities of color bear a disproportionate burden of environmental harm. There are numerous studies that support this, and in particular, there are, a foundational study by the United Church of Christ basically showed that even if we take away income, that communities of color, so even middle wealth or middle class communities of color, are still more likely to have toxic facilities located near them than white communities. So race ends up being a thread that is something that we have to address when we talk about how do we achieve environmental justice, and what is environmental injustice? Environmental injustice, in addition to being harmful to poor people, it is deeply harmful to people of color. And that legacy, that the racism that is associated with environmental injustice really is, as we get to dealing with the vestiges of, long-term structural and institutional racism. So not people's intentional acts of racism that, most of us would be really shocked to encounter, but looking at how policies over, at this point, over hundreds of years, have resulted in people of color bearing a disproportionate burden of environmental harm. So historic legal discrimination, so we, that's being really clear about the fact that so environmental injustice is an international issue, but from the perspective of the United States, we know that there was legal segregation of the races. It wasn't until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that it was actually declared that, separate but equal was no longer the law of the land. So that's part of that, that history of systemic racism, this idea that the races had to be separate. So, go back further than that, when, the same not the same justices, but the same institution, the body of the Supreme Court, had ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson, that it was okay to separate the races in transportation. So historic legal discrimination is one of the causes of environmental injustice. Zoning, so these decisions that happen on the local level about where polluting facilities can be located. that's a tremendous cause of environmental injustice. And these decision-making boards, even the makeup of those boards, contribute to environmental injustice by tending to be not very diverse. So like if you look at planning boards in cities and towns that do have these departments across the nation, there are studies that support that these boards are not representative of the communities in which they operate, really often being not having many people of color who are making decisions about where different types of land uses can be located. Because once a piece of land has been cited has been designated as heavy industrial or industrial, then that really locks in that parcel for a type of use that is going to really necessarily not be directed at more, sustainable practices that are healthy for the environment. And if you are in a census tract that's adjacent, or if you're in a parcel that's adjacent to a parcel that's been cited, that's been designated as heavy industrial, then you are now in the airshed of an area that may have a permit to pollute. Our whole environmental law system really is based on permits to pollute. So these zoning decisions that happen at the local level about what type of uses can happen end up being causes of environmental injustice. And those decisions get made often based on the idea that the communities are not going to push back against that change in zoning. Market forces, that's citing a facility where it's going to be, beneficial for the bottom line of wherever that facility needs to be sited. So that's also a cause of environmental injustice. So if land is already less valuable, and there are also there's support for land near communities of color being less valued than land in white communities, then that land may be that land is going to be one that is more attractive for siting a facility that may be a polluting facility. And then there's lack of political power. Whenever there is a question about whether there is an possible environmental injustice, looking at the political power or lack thereof of that community has to be done, because these are the situations where that there are decisions made at the local level, decisions made even at the state level on permitting, keeping in mind what is the community where the impacts of this decision are going to be felt, and is that community one that has enough political power, even social capital, to push back against that decision. So I wanted to ground our discussion in some of the causes of environmental injustice. So looking at environmental, so SELC is a regional law center, and I'll talk more about environmental justice and injustices in our region. And I'll also add, when talking about environmental justice, there's also the Environmental Protection Agency decision. So the Environmental Protection Agency definition, because I think it's good to know it and to compare it to the environmental movement, particularly the environmental justice movement definition. So if we look at environmental racism being where people of color bear a disproportionate burden of environmental harm, and environmental justice as being the environmental movement's response to that fact. And then environmental justice as defined by the Environmental Protection Agency as, full participation, fair treatment, and meaningful involvement of people of color and low-income people in environmental decision-making. That the EPA's definition of environmental justice is very much process-oriented and about making sure that people of color and low-wealth communities are able to participate in the environmental decision-making process. And there's a federal executive order that, so the 1994 executive order of Bill Clinton, That's Executive Order 12898 that directs all federal agencies to assess whether or not their actions would cause a disproportionate and adverse impact on communities of color and low wealth communities. And then we have a new environmental justice executive order from President Biden, Executive Order 14008, that really, I think, has some promising new facets and there's promising new agreements and intention from this administration. That executive order creates a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It creates a White House Environmental Justice Committee that's led by the director of the Council for Environmental Quality, Brenda Mallory, who just recently left SCLC to join the Biden administration. And it also sets out, really ambitious goals. The Justice 40 initiative is a part of the new Environmental Justice Executive Order that basically says that 40% of sustainable energy investment should be directed to overburdened communities across the nation. So May 27th, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, that was their deadline to give their recommendations to the White House on ways to make that happen. So, and we'll get to see, I think, over the coming months, how these investments are being directed to overburdened communities. And those investments, I think it's interesting, the promises are in the areas of clean water, infrastructure, clean energy and efficiency, affordable housing, workforce development. Those are some of the areas where this, substantial investment is to be directed in overburdened communities. So that type of, I think that's more than participation. It's actually, directed to getting dollars to communities that have been, where there's been underinvestment over the years. And there's also an environmental justice scorecard that is a part of the new environmental justice executive order from the Biden administration that where they're going to set up, like how they are making progress on achieving environmental justice. So this idea that as participants in, U.S. civil society, we're going to get to view how well this administration does in meeting environmental justice goals. So those are, so thinking about the process definition and then thinking about all of the different other ways, the process definition of environmental justice, and then environmental justice as being much broader than that. It can, like, thinking about investment, thinking about all the different tools that can be used to get to the end result of communities of color not bearing a disproportionate burden of environmental harm, and reversing harm that has already happened where that's possible. So across our region, so SCLC is doing work across our region. We've, in the state of Virginia, in Union Hill, we stopped a polluting compressor station for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. So we worked directly with a community of color that was made up of basically the descendants of formerly enslaved people who really were worried about the air quality impacts from the compressor station that would have been necessary for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline if it were constructed. So in that case, my colleague David Neal went to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and got a favorable decision from the Fourth Circuit on environmental justice grounds. So that's really significant. There's not a lot of case law on, how specifically on environmental justice grounds, acknowledging that environmental injustices are a problem, noting that there was a state, Virginia Air Pollution Control Board directive to consider the health impacts and the health of the population where a particular facility would be sited, that consideration against the backdrop of already acknowledged, policy and guidance regarding environmental justice, led to this favorable decision that basically prevented this compressor station from going forward in the Union Hill community. So in the state of North Carolina, there's a number of different matters where we are working with groups that are led by people of color, made up of people of color. And in this particular mention relates to Belews Creek Coal Ash, which a number of you on as a part of this talk already know about. So I'll actually not get into so many details about that, but SELC, we had litigation across the state of North Carolina regarding every unlined coal ash pond in the state. But the Belews Creek Coal Ash Pond in particular presented environmental injustice issues because of the census tract in which it is located. So there's an environmental justice issue example for the state of North Carolina. In South Carolina, we've been working with the community right outside of Charleston, basically pushing back against a road project that would bifurcate this historic African-American community. And this happened so much in the 70s with the creation of our really impressive federal highway system, that system ended up being very destructive in a number of ways for communities of color, because many road projects did bifurcate communities of color. And what that means for those communities is like, really interrupting the social structure of that community, interrupting, the use and enjoyment of the property. There's the procurement of land through eminent domain, that this happened over and over again, but we are working with the community in South Carolina to prevent that. And so far have been successful in getting other routes on the table that would not be harmful to this African-American community. In the state of Georgia, we are working with an African-American community in DeKalb County to push back against a solid waste facility. It's a waste station, a waste facility called Metro Green, that really is inappropriate for the area. And there was really not adequate notice for this community regarding the siting of the facility. There has been a strategic lawsuit against public participation filed against members of the community who have pushed back. So this happens in all sorts of matters, but in the environmental justice context, it's significant to us that communities are being threatened with these SLAPP suits to really to back off advocating for themselves. But there were real air quality concerns at the, based from this facility. And the way that we've been advocating is in state court in Georgia, which is a different venue than we are usually advocating in. Typically in environmental law cases, we're in state administrative settings, or in federal court. State court is not the most likely place for an environmental case. In Alabama, I think this matter in Alabama is exemplary of how being located in the airshed of a polluting facility ends up being harmful. So there's a community right in Birmingham that's right beside an ABC Coke facility. So not only are there air quality impacts, there's a Superfund site right there. The community has had issues for years and years. We got involved in a settlement that would require reductions in air quality harm and directed funds to the community, the African-American community that's been impacted for years, negatively impacted from this facility. And then in Tennessee, we are currently working on opposition to the Helia Pipeline. And I have a few slides that I think are probably helpful in demonstrating, at least a slide on the Helia Pipeline. So the Helia Pipeline is in Memphis, Tennessee. It runs from, the proposal is to direct crude oil from up here at the Valero Memphis refinery down through a historic African-American community, the Boxtown community, where, and this is a historic African-American community, people constructed their homes from railroad car parts. This is Southwest Memphis, 38109 is the zip code. It's 97% African-American, low wealth, by less wealthy than the rest of Memphis. But so the proposal, 49 miles of pipeline, crude oil pipeline through the Boxtown community, and through also a drinking water well field that provides drinking water to over 1 million Memphians, including residents of the historic Boxtown community and Southwest Memphis, which is predominantly African-American. And this illustration demonstrates, the threat of putting a pipeline over a drinking water well field. So the problem exists where if there are breaks in the protective clay layer that covers the Memphis aquifer down here, then, and I mean that there's two types of pipelines, ones that are leaking and ones that will leak, that if there's a break in the clay layer, and we know that there are already breaches that exist, that it can actually get into the aquifer and eventually get to water supply wells that supply drinking water for Memphians. Our partner group there is African-American led community group, Memphis Community Against the Pipeline. They also operate as Memphis Community Against Pollution. And we're also working with Sierra Club and Protect Our Aquifer, some of our traditional conservation clients, on pushing back against this, really, this project is a real threat to water quality in Memphis. And that is, the opposition is very much being led by Memphis Community Against the Pipeline. So we have litigation in federal court, we have litigation in state court, because there were, this is a case where a land agent said in a community meeting about this pipeline that the company chose this route because it was the path of least resistance. That issue, that fact of the perception of lack of political power being an entree to—
Hang on, let's just unmute for one second.
Being an entree to environmental, really a door open to environmental harm to communities of color. Like, this is one of those really clear examples, since, the land agents said it when they were going about the process of, trying to get people's land, to get land in order to have the path to construct the pipeline. So, we are involved in state court to prevent condemnation proceedings. And there are lots of developments that have actually happened in the Helia Pipeline opposition. So I'm going to stop there since I'm almost right at my 30 minutes, or at least right at 10 o'clock. Have a few more slides, but I think we can move to a discussion about what I've said and maybe what people's questions are regarding environmental justice.
So if you want to go ahead, folks, and unmute if you want to ask a question, and we'll just see how that goes. If we need to go to raising hands, if there's too many coming in at once. But I think go ahead. If you do have a question, unmute yourself and go ahead and ask Chandra. Thank you, Chandra.
You're welcome.
Chandra, this is Steve Wall. Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about kind of undergrad students here at UNC. There's a lot of interest in environmental justice issues, and I was curious, from your perspective, are there any kind of research topics that would be, timely for capstone projects or independent study type work around environmental justice issues in North Carolina? Has anything kind of jumped to your to your mind that we can share with students? Thanks.
So what I would say is there's ongoing work on different environmental justice matters in North Carolina, and I'm not certain about who has already reached out. Our capstone projects, are capstone projects ones where the students are working directly with a outside entity, or are they picking their topics?
Yeah, they're led by a faculty member. They have an outside client that they're working on a specific topic for. Okay, so there's the biomass and wood pellets in Lumberton and the environmental justice issues related to that. I think there's the resiliency issues. So those recent studies regarding, FEMA not, basically not being as helpful to communities of color as to white people, and, what it means as we see a changing climate, more storms that are more devastating, and how do communities that don't have a lot of money, looking at resiliency and what can be done from a planning perspective to be helpful. There's managed retreat questions that still have to be looked into and explored, because that's a sticky issue. But getting more, I would say, more depth on how there may be areas that are not already researched on FEMA, and the lack of, less assistance for people who don't have a lot of money versus more assistance from people who are already established, which it just seems counterintuitive. But maybe there are some ideas about how to, make our own existing government structures better. I think that I was thinking the other day about the Department of Social Services and how social services can better incorporate environmental justice considerations, since we know that people who are, who are receiving assistance from social services, like these are communities that we know we would consider frontline in terms of being at risk of an environmental injustice. So how can social services be, how is social services already tuned into these issues, and what, are there, straightforward ways that social services can be, I suppose, activated to help achieve environmental justice. I mean, then there's biogas, of course, and I really don't know what the project would be on the biogas issue, but that's one of our active environmental justice. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey,
Chandra, I
Chandra,
have
it's Mike.
questions.
Oh,
Kathleen
Kathleen,
first.
go.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, you go.
Thank you. Great presentation. So nice to have you with us. And I just want to say before I ask my question, I love what you just said. How can social services be activated to increase environmental justice? I want us to have a conversation. Nisha and I are working on an environmental health and resilience fellows project that we'll talk about with you at some point. But I would love for us to sit down with some of the local governments we work with in Eastern North Carolina that are being disproportionately impacted by climate change and think about that question. So let's come back to that. But my question for you today was, will you tell us about one of the projects you've worked on where you really felt your impact? So sort of you came away from the project and you said, wow, my role as an attorney made a difference on this environmental justice issue.
So I think there are a number of ways, and this is not like, so I'll just say when we worked in Navassa, like this, there's a Superfund site. It's over 200 acres in size. It's the way that EPA approaches cleanup is that the site is divided into operable units. We have just moved on to operable unit 2, but at operable unit 1, there was going to be a decision to basically have a restrictive covenant on the first part of the site that said this part of the site can never be used for residential purposes. And through, being able to being able to retain an expert, being able to talk directly with the town planning board about them being clear that they want residential use in the future. They want cleanup such that residential use can happen, that we were able to, through the notice and comment process, submit really extensive comments that were supported by community members. So the community group that we're working with down in Navassa, they got lots of letters saying, we want to see residential use. We want the best cleanup possible for this site. We don't just want you to leave the waste here because you've determined that the way that, so that the issue there was that the land was zoned in a way that residential use wasn't going to be a part of that parcel. So EPAs, I mean, I'm sure many of you know that EPAs doesn't have to clean up as much as possible. They have to clean up as much as possible for the next intended land use. So it was through, just being really, talking with the people in government. It's like we've heard, we know from having participated in this process that people have said they want residential use. And we know that we've heard that that is not just the private citizens, but that's also an interest, at least of some people in government. And we understood that there were concerns about gentrification, like if there's residential use, who is going to be able to be on this property once it's cleaned up. And just, through a number of different conversations, research, writing, pointing out, what the legal requirements are, that part of that, the proposed decision for that parcel changed. So now, and that was, so it's bittersweet, because the way that that change happened was that the part of the parcel that was contaminated such that residential use could not happen there, that parcel was cut off from the site, like cut off in the assessment. So the parcel was like 21.8 acres before our advocacy, and now the parcel is 20 acres. So because the 1.8 acres that was contaminated such that residential use would not have been possible, that is going to be assessed in the next operable unit. So that's bittersweet, because it's the decision still wasn't, we're going to just clean up this site. And we already have seen the documents that say cleaning up this particular parcel, the contamination is not that deep. And there's lots of money to do cleanup here. So, our entree, our getting in is like, we know that there's money available, and we know that it's not actually that difficult to get rid of this contamination, because it's, it's superficial, it's not that deep. But it was satisfying, because even though they cut off 1.8 acres before our intervention, that was going to be 21.8 acres that would have been forever unable, like 21.8 acres would have, 20 of those acres were good and clean enough to be used for residential use, but they would have had a restrictive covenant forever. And it really would affect how, what does redevelopment look like at this site once it gets taken care of? So, I mean, that was significant, because I think it put some wind underneath the wings of the community group in terms of their ongoing involvement. Like, they saw how their own expression of their wants could be acted on. They could see it happen. And it also showed me, I was like, the agency is willing to change when being presented with compelling information about what that local community wants. It's like the community had to say, we want this. And it ended up having, there was a resolution from the town board that was sent on to the EPA and the private cleanup contractors. So that's one example.
Hey, Chandra, this is Mike. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Hey, Mike.
I was wondering, as we talk about just solutions to things that are maybe a little less defined than like a polluter or a pollution event, solutions to things like climate change, does SCLC's approach remain the same, or is it a different way that you engage if there's not a clear series of events that led to an injustice, but rather a series of things that have disproportionately negatively affected a community.
Do you have a specific example in mind?
Well, I mean, having grown up in Kinston, I think it's become clear that there are a lot of things in Kinston that are disproportionately affecting people not of means and communities of color, but they may not be like a defined event, like a big polluter. It may be just the fact that water level was rising. So I wonder, as making sure that solutions are just, whether the playbook is the same to advocate for those communities. I just wasn't sure how it would happen in a legal context when there is not as much of a defined event that has led to the negative situation.
So I would say that in a situation where the answer is a policy solution, that number one, we still are, we're starting with our environmental justice initiative, even though we've been doing this work because, we represent who we represent. And sometimes those people are people of color. But when there's if we're looking at a policy solution, because I think that is one where it's like, there's several layers of actions that probably need to take place in order to make things better. My approach, since I get to talk about my approach as leading the initiative in coordination with other people at SCLC, is that we still need to be talking directly with the people who are feeling the harm, who are experiencing it, and understanding what outcomes they want to see and the order in which they want to see them. So I think that should be an approach that we are always using. And I can say we don't always use that because there's lots of people, we're a big organization. There are lots of people, we're a big organization. The environmental community is a big community, and everybody, I think, environmental advocates, people who care about the environment being safe and healthy for everybody, are trying to do the best that they can with what they know. And they might not be talking directly with the people who are most harmed. So they may be suggesting policy solutions just based on it seeming to be good policy. So there's lots of, thinking of, now we know there's this huge federal infrastructure package. Where do these infrastructure dollars go? What does it take for a community to be able to be a recipient of infrastructure funding? I recently had a conversation. This is public. This is in the news. In Uniontown, Alabama, you could read the articles that talk about how there was a decision that's being proposed to take over the waste board for Uniontown by another entity, and that was required in order for that town to get federal funds to operate the new facility. But the mayor said in the article, this same group who is now going to be in control, bye Holly, is now going to be in control of this system. They did not do a good job on the last project. And we're not ready to turn over our system without having more guarantees that this new project is going to actually be beneficial for the citizens of Uniontown, who have a lot of septic issues. They have wastewater issues. And they're like, this project is going to benefit some other companies, down the road. We're not certain it's going to benefit us. So, I think in a situation like that, so as attorneys, we're going to pick, we make a decision about who our clients are, and we look at where their interests and our interests overlap, and we work in that area. There are going to be situations where the same community will differ on what the solution is. But so from my perspective, well, if I've, said and stated in a representation agreement, I'm working with this community, and I believe what they are seeking is a reasonable and good choice, then I'm advocating with them, even though there could be another choice that could also be reasonable and good. So if there's litigation, then, you know, I'm going to choose a side. If there's policy, I still think we need to talk to who's directly impacted. And then there still may end up being a side in that policy matter, but, you know, there's not a representation agreement. So our approach is the same in that you work for who you agree to work with. Like that, you establish that relationship and you go with it until that relationship falls apart because your interests diverge. But if there's, you know, infrastructure money, I would think all the time, yes, infrastructure money going to a community is great. You're going to get great outcomes because there's more money that's going to fix the problem. But even in that situation, there are people in the local community who could differ about how that infrastructure funding is going to be helpful or not. So, that's a long, winding answer. And I could probably, I like that you asked it. I would like to keep talking about it, but I feel like I might be getting a little bit too theoretical and conceptual. There may be other questions. Did you have a follow-up, Mike?
I didn't. No, I appreciate it. Thank you. And I'm just really, I hadn't thought of the infrastructure bill as a big giant solution waiting to happen, and how much there is to do to make sure that those solutions are not only effective, but hopefully just as well.
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of, so when I think about like, yeah, as a person from Kansas, I was like, are flooding issues because this community, this is not ever a good place for a community to be built. Like this is one of those places that, you know, people who didn't have a lot of money and Black people are like, you go be over there. We know that land is not good land. And that was a bad decision. Or is it because there's disinvestment and like that there could be engineering solutions that make that place okay? Or there could just be something as simple as, you know, stormwater drainage, like that lots of communities have. So I do think infrastructure could be a solution in a number of places. Like if it's a place that's over here that it actually is okay, this land is okay for people to live on, it just needs a little bit of help so that there's not flooding. That's my theory right now. There are people who know a lot more about this. So, but anyway.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
Hi, Chandra. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the nice talk. Very, very interesting. The study came, I just put a link to the article on chat. This came out a few weeks ago from a bunch of investigators across the country, looking at air pollution and disproportionate exposures specifically for Americans of color. Now, I've done some work in this domain studying air pollution, and I've seen from different analysis that there is a disproportionate sense of exposure. But what struck me from this particular study was the highlight in this article, which talks about disproportionately and systematically harms Americans of color. So as somebody who's worked in this, Chandra, what do you think about this particular comment about systematic harmful air pollution based upon how we have institutional policies in the country in terms of how various facilities and infrastructure has been developed over the years, where this specifically targets one set of people in how they are affected by air pollution? What did you think when you came across the study, perhaps, and your reaction to that, please?
So I haven't seen the study other than you just posting it, but I mean, I think that supports what I see. So unfortunately, I mean, it's like, that sounds right, that there are that, and I'm not sure how they set out the systematic exposure, but I can imagine like just the way that housing choices are, like where people are able to stay, where facilities are able to site because of our zoning regulations, that those are just two of the systematic ways that I think that communities of color would be disproportionately exposed to air pollution. You know, I think that our legal system has to be willing to confront that and address it. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. I think the laws on the books should support disrupting that system. but we haven't gotten there yet.
A follow-up question back to the previous point that you and Mike were talking about in terms of the new infrastructure that the new administration is trying to put in. Do you think that may get to addressing some of this and perhaps have equity in how infrastructure is being deployed?
So do you say, is that a part of the decision-making process?
Yes.
I mean, it is the overlay that is envisioned by the Justice 40 initiative should help with that. But the big package, as far as I know, doesn't have an equity lens. I mean, well, the big package hasn't even gotten across the finish line yet, right? But everybody is excited about a brand new America. I know I am. I was like, oh, right. It's like a renovation for the whole country. Like, look, we get like a new kitchen, new bathroom, new tile. I think I'm excited to see this get across the finish line. And I don't see an equity lens yet for the bill. So, I mean, I think that would be a great addition. And I'm hopeful that the Justice 40 initiative will be helpful in a part of that, because certainly some portion of this infrastructure package like that, I think that has to be considered like sustainable energy investments, that this money, like that Justice 40 initiative is directed at like all of federal spending. So that would include whatever infrastructure package gets across the finish line. So I think that's a great idea, and one that, I need to talk more about. Thanks for mentioning it.
Thank you, Chandra.
So I have an unusual question. It's good to see you. I'm curious to know, and forgive me if I'm putting you on the spot. I don't mean to, but I'm curious to know about, your perception and experience on the Board of Visitors so far, and kind of how you see that your position on the BOV continuing, flourishing. I'm not coming up with the right word, but I think you know what I'm saying. How do you see your role on the BOV and in this work?
Well, I'm really excited to find out that environmental justice had been is something that is a new focus. And for me, like, this is my area of expertise. Like, this is a place where I can lend a lot of experience that is, it's growing, it's evolving. So it's an area that I can contribute to IE, like, actively. My starting out, my agreement to participate really had a lot to do with, being a grad of UNC, being a person of color who works in an environmental field. I was excited and interested about, like, how this can create more opportunities to diversify the field. The board is really interesting. It's a big board with a lot of people with varied experiences. But, my initial thought was, okay, how can I, make sure that there are more people of color who are taking part in environmental issues, like through IE. And I also, so that's one thing. There are other things too that I'm excited about. But it's nice to be in a position, I think, to know that I can be more of a contributor to what the Institute knows and what y'all are doing. Like I said, there's not a lot of places where I think that I'm qualified to help ask for money to get something done. But I think, like, this is one of those areas. And it's also, I consider, not in conflict with my role, my development role at SELC, because we do different things. And the type of funding that's required to run the Institute is different, I think, than what is necessary at SELC. I mean, y'all don't do litigation. That's not whereas anybody who's coming to SELC knows, like, that's part of what it is that we do. So I'm excited about finding ways to, lift up this, to find out more about how IE is, in the environmental justice space and to really lend assistance, ideas like on the research, being present in terms of development, like if it's helpful for me to, talk about how the work is important and needs to be supported. And yeah, I had a third thing, but I just forgot it. So, but I don't know, did I touch on some of the things that you were interested in knowing about?
Definitely. I see others in the group nodding their heads. I think, your perception of your role on the BOV is probably what a lot of us hope for in terms of our engagement with you in the future, and other board members too. But yeah, I saw Megan and others nodding their heads. Definitely, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, and I think it's probably on this it's this substantive issue. Like, I actually feel like there are more people who, the BOV is a big board. So I don't think about like y'all as needing like more people, but you seek more people. Like on this issue, there are probably more people who I could talk to directly about their interests. Whereas with the board in general, I have a harder time envisioning how my connections bring more people to the board, even though I'm sure my connections do. It's just harder for me to conceptualize how to bring more people in. So I think over time, that'll change for me as I learn more about IE and all the different things that you do. But with environmental justice, like it is, it's my career, it's a passion, it's important, it's easy for me to talk about to people why it is important and they should be interested. So the idea of bringing more people, building friendships, I see a very clear path to achieving that.
Yeah, I'm willing to bet a few of my colleagues we're all on the same page with you about that.
Mm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chandra, I had a question, and this can be our closing because I know we're getting down to the end of this. But can you share if you took any environmental classes at Carolina, and whether you did or not? How did you get from Carolina going to law school and deciding that environmental justice was going to be your path? Because you seem very passionate about it and very engaged, and I just would like to know how you got there.
I don't think I took any environmental classes at Carolina. And can you tell, I was like, how long has the Institute of Environment existed? I should have been I've been to Duke's Marine Lab. Like, I spent like 5 weeks there. I was like, why have I never been to this one until I'm like middle-aged? What's happening? But so no environmental classes. I'm a failed scientist. I wanted to be a scientist, and I was not good at it. If I had gone to like a smaller school, I think, and it's just me. If I had gone to a smaller school, I think I might have become a scientist. But I remember like 200 people in my freshman chemistry class. I was like, oh, I don't know what's going on. Let me just do enough. I might even drop that class. But anyway, yeah, but so environmental law allows me to have that interaction with science, because I still have to understand it enough to explain it to a judge and to explain it to whoever needs to hear about, it to make a decision that's favorable to whoever I'm working with. But so there's a podcast, SCLC has a podcast called Broken Ground, and I have an episode, and I actually think it's interesting to listen to. It's 24 minutes, so you can hear more about me and environmental justice and how I got here. But that's the short story. I didn't take environmental classes until I got to law school. And even the environmental class I took at law school, I took it when I was studying abroad. But there's no reason, like there were classes available to me at Carolina. I just wasn't as tuned in. So it is really a link between my interest in science, my interest in health, and just being always, social justice is kind of like a thread that just goes under everything that I'm interested in doing. So that led me to this. Like, you know, I'm going to be able to do work that like is important globally. It's science involved, and my one of my natural aptitude happens to be advocacy. So that's how I got there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank y'all. I'm glad I got to start off the day. Where's bagels? I didn't see any bagels.
I know. No, we didn't have them today. That's in the real world. When we get back in person, we will have bagels. We'll have to have you come back to have bagels.
I meant to bring mine just so I could show y'all. There's the Broken Girl podcast. I hope y'all have if you listen, and it's a great podcast, not just my episode.
I'll definitely listen.
I'd love to share it in our newsletter if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, share it.
Thank you so much, Chandra. This was fantastic. I think everyone got a lot out of this. We're excited that you were here with us this morning, and thank you again for your time. And I think that's going to be a wrap for this edition of our Bagel Breakfast.
My pleasure. I look forward to seeing everybody soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chandra.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody have a great day.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.